In this video, I'll be detailing the rise of Al-Qaeda throughout the 1990s as part of my Road to 9/11 video series. I'll be going over their major attacks on the United States, the early stages of the planning of what would become the September 11th attacks, and some of the key names involved in Al-Qaeda that would lead us to 9/11. In my last video, I detailed how Osama Bin Laden and Al-Qaeda were based in Sudan by the early 1990s. From here, they would plan their first operations. The very first attack against the United States that Al-Qaeda would carry out would take place in Aden, Yemen. Here, Al-Qaeda's target was American troops bound for Somalia. The plan was to bomb two hotels that were being used to house U.S. Marines. On December 29, 1992, a bomb was detonated at the Gold Mahur Hotel that killed an Austrian tourist and a Yemeni worker. 4 other Austrian tourists were wounded. Around the same time, a second bomb was detonated prematurely at the Aden Movenpick Hotel, and 3 more people were wounded. No Americans were harmed in the attacks. The troops that Al-Qaeda were targeting had already left for Somalia by the time of the bombing attack. With no American casualties, the attacks did not register as a high priority for the United States, though it was believed Americans were the target. By early 1993, there was some evidence that Bin Laden and Al-Qaeda were responsible. During this time, Al-Qaeda and Bin Laden still weren't heavily on the United States' radar. They were a known quantity, but their threat to the U.S. seemed minimal, though they were perceived as a thorn in Saudi Arabia's side due to Bin Laden's vocal opposition to the monarchy's policies pertaining to the U.S. forces being stationed within Saudi Arabia. This led to King Fahd of Saudi Arabia personally revoking Bin Laden's Saudi citizenship and successfully pressuring his family to end his $7 million a year stipend. Around this time, the Saudi government also pressured Sudan to expel Bin Laden from their nation, which was supported by the United States. In response to these actions by the United States and Saudi Arabia, Al-Qaeda would plan their next attack targeting both nations. The target was a building being used by the Saudi Arabian National Guard as a headquarters. The U.S. also had a mix of military personnel and contractors that worked there as part of a training mission. On November 13, 1995, around 11:20 a.m., a car bomb was detonated outside the building. 5 Americans and 2 Indians were killed in the blast, and nearly 70 people were wounded, mostly Americans. Al-Qaeda had finally spilled American blood. The investigation into the bombing identified 4 individuals with ties to Al-Qaeda training camps who were involved in the bombing 5 months later. They confessed and were sentenced to death in Saudi Arabia. The Saudis increased pressure on Sudan to expel Bin Laden. Sudan eventually allowed Bin Laden the opportunity to leave, which he took advantage of in May of 1996, leaving Sudan on a chartered flight to Jalalabad, Afghanistan. Bin Laden lost most of his assets in Sudan and is estimated to have lost between $20 million and $300 million in assets, seriously weakening him and Al-Qaeda as a whole. In Afghanistan, Bin Laden formed close ties with Mullah Omar, the leader of the Taliban and the de facto ruling regime of Afghanistan. The Taliban allowed Al-Qaeda to return to their old training camps from the war with the Soviet Union in exchange for financial and military support. Around this time, Al-Qaeda also began training militants on behalf of the Pakistani Inter-Service Intelligence Agency. This provided much-needed financial support to Al-Qaeda. While in Afghanistan, Bin Laden authored his first fatwa that was titled Declaration of War Against the Americans Occupying the Land of the Two Holy Places, where he detailed his grievances against the United States. Also in 1996, a man named Khalid Sheikh Muhammad arrived in Afghanistan and became a full-fledged member of Al-Qaeda. Khalid Sheikh Muhammad's nephew, Ramzi Youssef, had been responsible for the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, which Sheikh Mohammed had provided advice and guidance for. Here, Sheikh Mohammed proposed his first draft of what he called the Plains Operation. This initial plan involved hijacking up to 10 airliners and crashing them into targets on the east and west coasts of the United States. The targets were to be the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, the CIA and FBI headquarters, the U.S. Capitol Building, the U.S. Bank Tower in Los Angeles, and the Columbia Center in Seattle. The plan was rejected by Bin Laden at the time as being far too elaborate and beyond al-Qaeda's capabilities. But the seed had been planted, and Khalid Sheikh Muhammad was devoted to his idea. The next 2 years were spent rebuilding al-Qaeda's strength and financial footing. In February 1998, Bin Laden issued a second fatwa in conjunction with 4 leaders from other Islamic fundamentalist groups. He again outlined his grievances against the United States, namely the U.S.'s support of Israel, the U.S. military presence in Saudi Arabia, and his belief that the United States was waging a war against the Muslim world. Around this time, the planning began for al-Qaeda's next attack, this time targeting American embassies in Africa. The next few months saw al-Qaeda prepare 2 bombs that were to be loaded onto 2 separate trucks. All told, the bombs weighed approximately 2,000 pounds each. The targets were the U.S. embassies in Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. The date of the attack was scheduled for August 7th, which was the 8th anniversary of the arrival of U.S. troops in Saudi Arabia during the Gulf War. At around 10:30 a.m. on August 7th, the 2 trucks were parked outside their respective targets that were located approximately 500 miles apart. They both detonated almost simultaneously. In Dar es Salaam, the U.S. Embassy was located outside the city center in an upscale neighborhood. The casualties from the Tanzania bombing totaled 11 dead and 85 wounded. In Nairobi, the U.S. Embassy was in a downtown section of the city. The blast caused a neighboring building that housed a secretarial college to collapse that greatly increased the casualties. In Nairobi, 213 people were killed and over 4,000 were wounded. The totals from the attacks left 224 dead, of which 12 were Americans. The attacks triggered a military response from the United States in the form of Operation Infinite Reach on August 20th. The objective was to strike al-Qaeda training camps in Afghanistan and a pharmaceutical factory in Khartoum, Sudan, where the U.S. believed chemical weapons were being manufactured for Bin Laden. Around 7:30 p.m. local time, 13 Tomahawk missiles were launched at the Al-Shifa pharmaceutical factory, destroying it and killing 1 Sudanese employee and wounding 10 others. The factory, in fact, was not producing chemical weapons and had been used only for peaceful purposes. U.S. intelligence had been wrong. In Afghanistan, between 60 and 75 Tomahawk missiles were launched at 10 p.m. local time. The targets were several training camps in eastern and southern Afghanistan. The missile attacks largely destroyed the infrastructure of the camps and killed up to 50 al-Qaeda militants. The missile attacks failed to kill Bin Laden or any of the top al-Qaeda leadership. Overall, the operation did little damage to al-Qaeda as a whole, and the destruction of the Al-Shifa plant severely harmed the U.S. image in the Muslim world. The strikes were seen as a political and strategic victory for al-Qaeda. In the wake of their successful attack on the U.S. embassies, Bin Laden began to look towards another objective. In late 1998, he gave Khalid Sheikh Muhammad approval to begin planning a scaled-back version of his earlier planes operation. The details of this planning will be covered in my next video. If you enjoyed this video and found it useful, please leave a like so that I can reach more people. Thank you, and I'll see you on the next one.